o'clock on the East Coast. My name is Beth Noveck. I'm director of the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern and its partner project, the GovLab, and curator of this wonderful series, Reboot Democracy in the Age of AI, where we endeavor to have largely hopeful conversations, which we can use these days, focused on ways in which technology can help us, when used correctly, to strengthen our democracy, improve our government, and help us to strengthen civility in our discourse. So I am delighted to be welcomed today by Ed Bice from Meedan. We're going to have a bit of a fireside chat with him about the amazing work that they are doing using AI to fight misinformation and disinformation around the world. If you are joining us, Ed, I'm sure would love to know who is here. So please feel free to right click on your name to rename yourself and add your identification, in other words, your organization, pronouns, anything else that you want so he knows who's in the room. If you feel like turning on your video, we'd love to see you so we have a sense of being together. With that said, however, we're going to spotlight Ed so that we can bring him into the conversation. And we'll put his bio in the chat as we're going to have a bit of a chat between us for a few minutes. But as he's going along, please feel free to share any comments that you have in the chat. We have a lot of experts in the room who I'm sure would love to answer your questions or have conversation as we go along. If you have questions for Ed, please use the Q&A button at the bottom. Please put the Q&A, but use the Q&A button at the bottom to add your questions for him. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, let's dive in. With that said, Ed, thank you so much for being here. I think whereas for us, your reputation precedes you, for many people here, it might be their first time hearing about Meedan. So perhaps you could provide a little bit, I'm sure you're used to doing this, a little bit of intro to Meedan and its mission, and really the problem that you're trying to solve and how this all got started.
Thanks very much, Beth, for the invitation, first off. Really happy to be speaking with you all today, and I am the world's authority on the history of Meedan, so I speak with a lot of credibility on the topic. And I do so because I was the founding CEO back at the beginning of the social internet, really. So maybe to explain what we do, which our mission statement relates to kind of building a more equitable internet and kind of trying to improve the world through improving the internet. But to understand how we got here is, I think, it's a good story, and it gives you a good understanding of why we're doing what we're doing. So I was a pretty uninvolved citizen up until 2003, when I decided to go to a protest because I was really concerned about the U.S. foreign policy post 9/11. And it was the first day of the second Iraq War, April 2003, and I was arrested. And being arrested caused me to want to send an email out. And sending that email out to 5 friends changed the trajectory of my life. One friend wrote back and said, "I'm going to publish this as a full-page ad in the New York Times." Or I want to publish this as a full-page ad. And I said, okay. I was a designer at the time. And I said, well, okay, putting the design cap on, the real issue here is that we've got radically different understandings of the same event through the 2 lenses of, Arab language media, English language media. Let's create a social network for people to translate, share, remix, and and discuss um, uh, how narratives surrounding the same event in the world are seen differently. And we'll do this across two languages, and we'll have one interface, and it'll be a social network. And so it was a really like crazy ambitious idea, and it attracted the attention of MacArthur Foundation, and they brought in IBM research, and suddenly this really crazy idea that this guy living in Northern California had was a major research initiative for IBM Corporation, and they spent 3 years building out the craziest social network that was beloved by translators and journalists and kind of Middle East geeks. And so that was the start of Meedan. And we were going to fix the world by giving the world this way to understand things, and totally through the lens of, or through the eyes of, people who were most impacted by these decisions. And that was great. And it had us, and I promise I won't spend the whole hour on this story, but it had us establishing a base of operations in Cairo in 2007. And so that led to us kind of being in the middle of that moment of history. And when the dust settled, we had done, I think probably still to this date, one of the most inspiring crowdsourced translation projects that's ever been undertaken. 300 translators working at the same time, translating all this content, and from all around the social web and through audio messages when the internet was down. And keep in mind, this was like peak hopefulness, like the internet, plus millions of people had just brought down a dictator. And in spite of that, like moment of hopefulness, we were like looking around, talking amongst ourselves and saying, hey, how much of this content that we translated and redistributed was authentic? How much of it was, inauthentic? And really, we should take the ideas that we've been working on around crowdsourced translation and media aggregation and apply that to verification and fact checking. We said, this is really great right now, but the internet's going to have a big, so we're kind of prescient in that regard, and really started working on misinformation in 2011 as a result of our experience kind of redistributing a ton of content during Arab Spring. And that was the start of building out a platform that's now called Check, that is basically a tool that allows journalists to collaborate and fact check, verify, contextualize any piece of online content.
So Ed, let me just interrupt you here for a second to ask you, which is I think where you're going anyway, is fast forward for us to the Mexican elections in
Yep.
2024, or you're in 65 countries. You can pick another example if you prefer, but
Sure.
explain to us how Czech works in the context of one of these electoral examples, so
Yep.
we can just really dig in. And again, you have more than one platform, so maybe just give us a quick illustration of what happened in the Mexican elections and what was the impact.
Sure. So I'm actually, I'll talk about the Brazilian election because it was bit larger scale. So in 2022, we worked with 6 media partners in Brazil, and the election there, obviously a national presidential election in 2022. The TSE, the electoral authority in Brazil, came to us and asked us to build a chat bot. We already had in motion a program with these 6 media partners, so we were able to set up a WhatsApp line for each one of those 6 partners, and then a separate WhatsApp number for the TSC, and the TSC publicized that number. They have a ton of credibility, although some political divisions in Brazil related to TSC and the Bolsonaro regime at the time made it a pretty that institution was under a lot of pressure. But they decided that taking on electoral misinformation was a critical part of their remit. So they set up this tip line. They asked people on WhatsApp to forward them any content, electoral misinformation, or even just questions they had about the election. Where to vote, information about candidates, etc. Our media partners, which were 6 of the leading fact-checking media organizations in Brazil, had access to those questions that were coming in through the TSC's instance of check, were able to respond to those and feed into a database that then was used to power the TSC chatbot. So it's essentially one-on-one journalism, responsive journalism, because it's one user messaging in and a response coming back to them. But every time that a user asks a question that is similar to one that's been asked before, the chatbot, automates that back. Every time a journalist takes on a new question and answers it, that goes into the database and kind of forms, it creates a type of AI that is a set of questions and answers, and we're looking for clusters of questions or a question that looks similar to one we've seen before, and then we can emanate a response back. So we sent hundreds of thousands of individual responses to voters in Brazil over a 6-week period. And then the assumption is that they take that response, which is coming through the TSC, but has, the Aos Fatos or the Lupa journalism logo behind it. And then they push that into private and family, friends and family groups, and steer it around WhatsApp. So it is the only way of doing responsive journalism in encrypted messaging applications. It's all opt-in. It's people wanting information and journalists responding to that. So,
And
yeah,
just a little bit about kind of how this has evolved over the years. I imagine there have been a lot of
yeah,
mistakes, missteps that have, or just inadequate responses that have led to this approach.
sure.
And maybe you can say a little bit more about also how it's working.
Yeah. So, the evolution from, doing media work in Egypt in 2007 to, working with the TSC in Brazil in 2022 it's pretty profoundly different work. We were working from 2012 through 2018 in open web settings. So Check was a tool that would, had a little bookmarklet and would allow you to bring content from anywhere on the web into your workspace, assess it, share it out. And we were used by projects like Bellingcat to do online investigation work and respond to content, either with a long form investigation or a brief verification saying, hey, this is a misattributed image or something like this. In 2018, we worked on our first Mexican election project, Verificado. And that project had us standing up a WhatsApp number to take in submissions from users. And that was so popular, it knocked over the WhatsApp small business app. And as a result, WhatsApp management reached out to us and said, we noticed what you're doing. We think it's really important. Would you consider integrating your software with our business API? So that was the beginning. 2018 was the beginning of us really moving into messaging spaces, and that was important for two reasons. One, um, hello.
Sorry.
Uh,
Comes to every reboot democracy
as
lecture.
long as my office dog doesn't see your office cat, we'll be fine. It might bring down the webinar. Um, so number one, closed messaging spaces are like the final frontier. It's where this work is most difficult. It's where disinformation is most pernicious because nobody can see it, nobody can respond to it. So that was one thing. Second thing is that it was really hard to convince media organizations to use a new piece of software to do work that was kind of replacing their CMS, and it was a hard pitch going to a newsroom and saying, hey, we're the only solution that you can use if you want to do journalism in this new setting. And by the way, we've got a funded program from one of the platforms to help you do that. It just made a lot of business. We're a nonprofit, but it made a lot of business sense for us to really lean into that and reorient our engineering around messaging platforms, and that's been, the last 6 years have really been focused on how do we do this work in messaging settings.
Ed, could you contextualize this a little bit in terms of the landscape of solutions in the misinformation space and how you've landed in this space, which is very squarely a little bit inspired, it seems to me, by the PolitiFact model of working with media and working with journalists on trying to source high quality content. But in this disinformation space, there have obviously been other solutions. I'm thinking about sort of pre-bunking campaigns, for example, or some of the automated comment marking work that Google's Jigsaw has been working on. So could you help us just sort of understand that landscape a bit better and where you fit into it? And whether, this is how this differs from country to country. Is this an American question that I'm asking you, or is this relevant across the cultures where you're working in? Sort of what do you see as working and not working, and where does this fit in?
Yeah. So regarding what's working and what's not working, I think that nothing's working. I think that our information landscape is a disaster right now, and I think that the collective efforts of the community, the kind of misinfo community. At a couple of meetings, I like jokingly referred to it as the misinformation industrial complex, and now the right has rebranded us as censorship industrial complex. So I feel kind of slightly guilty about invoking that, but in all seriousness, we saw from 2011 when we started working in the space to 2020, like every serious, research university was in one way, shape, or form doing misinformation research. There were dozens of tools and projects, and it really just kind of took over a lot of the internet research and activism space. And I think that the our theory about how it was going to work, which I have radically revised in the last 2 years, was that we were going to do a good job of networking civil society and journalists. We were going to get good tools for sourcing public data, tools like CrowdTangle. We were going to have the enthusiastic partners enthusiastic partnership of the platforms because they had a horrible problem on their hands. And we were going to develop standards around how we mark up and assess this content so that when one piece of content is moving through Twitter and, urging violence against whatever group, that the response to that content would be shared with every other platform and they would be able to invoke this model. And we looked at CSAM work and GIFCT and the broadly the areas of coordinated response that were happening around uh, uh, CSAM in particular, and we were going to model something like that for showing important context around disinformation and misinformation, and addressing coordinated inauthentic behavior, coordinated campaigns, and everything was going to work because the platforms would be bought in on this, and the regulatory environment would recognize the importance of having an informed citizenry, and we'd create this whole ecosystem and there would be open data sets behind it and the world would be a better place. And that didn't work. And I think that we're kind of back, or we went back to the drawing board like a year ago, revisiting a lot of those assumptions.
Was Gen AI a big factor in that return to the drawing board?
Gen AI, I think, is co-occurring more than causative. I, we are really leaning into Gen AI, and it's super important for our work. But I tend to be and I think that there may be civilizational endangering aspects of AI, but I think that the impact of Gen AI on our information ecosystems is not as profound as the sort of evolution of those ecosystems themselves, like i.e. the distance between early versions of Facebook and what we now encounter with TikTok. I think that the role that deepfakes and Gen AI play in where we are, which report card like D minus on overall information ecosystem. How much of that do I think is Gen AI related? Not a lot. I'm willing to have that debate. I'm willing to revise my assessment if the social internet turns into a discussion among bots. But right now, I'm in the camp that says it's more about human behavior and interface design and what attention economies have done to journalism and media than it is like solidly about AI.
So, given all of those considerations, are we sort of putting a finger in the dike at this point? We had Frank McCourt from Project Liberty here in a talk not too long ago, speaking about, of course, business models he writes about, and his Project Liberty organization is trying to regulate social media companies with the view that, like, we can't solve these things with a technical solution. If we don't solve them by regulating social media companies, if we don't solve them, his view is, through ownership of our own data, and we won't solve them at all. So I'm just curious, in the landscape of kind of problems and issues here, can you help us sort, like, deepfakes, not that bad, misinformation of this kind worse, sort of help us to understand how to pick our battles in this space?
Yeah, I think it's really tough. I was up until last year, I was, you know, questioning that overall model, the kind of top-down model, but I was counting on regulatory reform as being a real driver for uh, getting the platforms to at least agree to prioritize the work and put resource behind it, under threat of punitive, uh, you know, uh, outcomes from DSA's misinformation clause and others. I don't think that's the case anymore, and I think it's got a lot to do with the um, uh, current American administration being used as a blunt force tool to curb the efficacy of EU and Brazilian and other regulatory regimes, and so I don't think it's going to happen in that way, at least not in the near future. Um, I do, you know, I do think that uh, if there is hope, the hope is that um, people want better lives. And when you give people better information over time, that will accrue value. And so um, people will put up with, identity reinforcing, value diminishing equations over the short term, but over the long term, I think that there is, if we're going to find hope, it's hope in this idea that uh, um, bad information leads to bad decisions. Bad decisions lead to pain. People move away from pain eventually. So um, our pivot is toward thinking about how um, giving up on the top-down model where we're working with platforms, coordinating efforts, working with media partners, to thinking about how we work from the grassroots up and how we empower communities to um, better access and distribute the knowledge they need. And I think that that's where we're taking our work in the misinformation space, and I think this also just is like recognizing that more and more energy, more and more content is moving into messaging spaces, and we've spent 6 years building software on top of messaging, and that might be, as we lose contracts with Twitter. We were doing the Twitter work around moments where we were um, helping contextualize important trending themes on Twitter. Lost that. We were doing some consulting for TikTok. Lost that. I think that Zuckerberg's long-term commitment to fact checking it's globally, I should say, is going to follow suit on their decision around the U.S. So I don't think that platform partnership driven misinformation response work is a good bet, and I think that moving into closed messaging spaces and kind of starting from the ground up is where I'm still hopeful that we're gonna see improvements.
So let me flag for folks that we're going to shift very shortly to all of your questions. So I want to encourage people, please, to use the Q&A to add more questions for Ed, and we'll get to those in just a second. So I want to pick up on this community-centered approach that you're talking about to understand what that looks like in terms of a shift for you Whether it's you've been working with national media organizations for so long. Is this about working with smaller, more grassroots media organizations? Is it about building new kinds of crowdsourcing or other sorts of community engagement components into the work that you're doing? And how do you have to pivot to accommodate the new reality, the post fact-checking reality?
Yep. So we've, worked with hundreds and hundreds of partners over the years, and, you know, among them Reuters and AP and AFP, but also a lot of small media collectives. And so we have experience working with small partners. Um, we see our future work as really building from those partnerships, and targeting local news in the U.S., which has not been a target partner for us in the past. But I think is a really, really interesting kind of, as we think about democracy and as we think about rebooting civics. There's obviously a lot of philanthropic energy into the local news space, but even aside from that, I think that at a time when, you know, polarization is where it is right now, when distrust in national media is where it is, I think that the idea of working to enable local newsrooms to meet information needs of their community through messaging is a really good place to start restoring democracy. And I think that you avoid all of the challenges of doing this work in the open, doing this work with platforms. The criticisms that you're censoring go away when you are simply helping newsrooms build better chatbots to distribute the content they're already creating, and 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 using AI to better understand the information needs of a community. Those two things are, like, to me, that's, kind of civic health DNA, understanding what a local community needs, and, doing a good job of using available resources to meet those needs, or signaling to a journalist, a reporter, hey, we've had 80 questions about this thing over here. How are we going to, you know, how are we going to keep, respond to this problem? And so I'm pretty optimistic about this as, both misinformation, or information quality play, and a, health of democracy play.
So your optimism I mean, I think you have to be optimistic to get up every day and do the kind of Herculean job that you do, juggling all of these balls. That optimism is not shared by a lot of people, whether it was the doomsday prognosticating about the election of 2024 and what would happen, or surely now. At least in the United States, there is a lot of despair. But we, for example, just on our blog today, we do the news every week on AI and democracy. We posted an article by Frank Pasquale, who at Cornell, who talks about AI creating citizen demoralization. So you get lots of people who say democracy is in the dustbin and AI is only going to make it worse. You're obviously a counterfactual to that, I think.
Yeah.
Um, what's your thought on this question? Is AI making us more cynical, more demoralized, or is AI the answer in this space, from
Um,
your perspective?
I so I'll hedge a little bit. It's doing both, but I don't agree with the assessment that um, the prospect of deep fakes is leading to this um, uh, uh, demoralization news consumers who no longer know whether what they're reading is fabricated or is true. I think that the demoralization comes from um, a political climate where, you know, crazy hyperbole, let's just call it crazy hyperbole to be generous, has become the norm. And I think people are pretty savvy about Gen AI and deep fakes. And, we are navigating through that. We certainly saw many examples in India and in other elections that we did this last year of deep fakes that were, that got traction and went viral. But I tend to think that we're just regarding this in the same way that, you know um, uh, when photographs began to be, commonly printed in newspapers, we started to expect visual content. We now just think of, I think we've got different, uh, we have a media literacy challenge for sure. Like we need to make sure that people know, you know, what's what can be done with deep fake video and come with, reasonable suspicion. But I don't think that that's a demoralizing factor, or not as much a demoralizing factor as the general tenor of the politics. And um, so so I disagree with that assessment, but I don't have any data to back up that, just a hunch.
So let me start to bring in some of the questions. We have so many of them that what I'm going to do is moderate some of the questions and just letting people know that with Ed's indulgence, what we'll do is when we finish our formal program, we do what we call virtual wine and cheese, where we invite people to ask their questions out loud and have more of a conversation if you're game to stay a little longer. But let me start by bringing in some of the questions. Given how under attack journalists are right now, how beleaguered they are, just not knowing how do they do their basic job in this environment in which they are quite literally under attack and perhaps unsafe. Puru asks about keeping the system that you're doing from overwhelming journalists. How do you actually help? Can people actually manage to do this on top of their day job?
Yeah, this is a really, really great question. So thanks for this. Um, Journalists hate doing this work. This is not journalism. This is not why you signed up to be a journalist. You didn't sign up to be a journalist so that you could battle the internet, you know. And there are a few journalists out there who love that, who revel in taking on trolls and responding to misinformation. But this is pretty thankless work. And so, you need to evolve. That this becomes a technical challenge for us, right? You need to evolve your technology and your workflows to motivate the people that you're asking to use your software. And so when I talked about, us leveraging AI in service of doing this work, what that means tangibly for the journalist is less time spent looking at an individual message coming in, more time spent like kind of taking in the signal, the aggregate signal, the trending questions, saying, okay, I better do a long form piece on this or do an article on this right now, typing that up, pushing that into our system, and having our system then, do the magic to train an AI on that product so that we can use that product, take an excerpt of that product and deliver that as a response to a question. So I think that future where journalism is a service, is an on-demand service, but not like the journalist is, bringing it is going back to the kitchen, fixing something up and bringing it to you. It's making use of content that journalists has created. They're doing their journalism, they're doing what they want to do, but the AI is repackaging that and delivering it, creating efficiency. Oh, you're muted.
It's not a Zoom without false muting and a cat or a dog. It's like your Zoom bingo card. So Daniel's asking a sort of technical question about adversarial AI training on misinformation, and I think that's the essence of what sort of what you're doing, except that there's a human kind of in the loop on that adversary on that training. Is there anything in terms of, and Daniel, you might want to clarify or add more to the question here, but I wanted to kind of push you on the technical approaches to what you're doing. If I may name check her, Beth Goldberg is here from Google Jigsaw. They've developed the Perspective API, which is used obviously to help filter out abusive comments and other kinds of comments. So I'm just curious sort of what the if there are any technical approaches that you're experimenting with, other people's tools that you're trying, or what's really working in terms of helping to stem this deluge.
Yeah. Shout out to Jigsaw, first off. We are researching and developing graph RAG approaches. So thinking about how we create structured data outputs that in the simplest explanation, we're looking to extract potential, take a piece of journalism, extract the questions that might be answered by that piece of journalism, and or take a set of questions and extract answers from a training set that includes relevant articles. And so kind of thinking first about graph RAG and then thinking secondly about how humans are put into the loop as and given the affordance to post edit LLM generated responses and kind of human verify those or human improve those, and think about generating, essentially an FAQ that powers a chatbot. So those like some of the technical approaches that we're taking, but always centered in like how do we put the human in the loop most effectively, and how do we signal that to an end user that this is a piece of content that a human has either authored completely or has validated or has improved. And I think those are like I'm really interested in issues of I used to have this talking point about AI where I would say the internet was a beautiful thing because everything was addressable, and we're entering an era when we don't have citations. Now we're starting to see not just perplexity, but everyone's recognizing that citations are important and that we need to that needs to be a part of AI workflow. We're trying to model that in a more granular way so that people can really dig at and see what the source text was that was behind a given machine response.
So we have a lot of questions for you in a variety of directions. So let me try to get some of them on the table for you, and I'm going to do a poor job of sorting them because there are so many at the moment. But Anjith is asking about sort of what we do and the fact that the journalists that you used to trust, and I think more than one person is asking about this, the journalists that you trust to do the fact checking are themselves the sources of misinformation. how does that complicate the system when it's not anonymous randos on the internet, but it's bias and misinformation just creeping into the standard press? It's not coming, he says, from anonymous sources. It's spread by the people who we consider credible.
Um, that's a bigger social problem, but I can say that one of the pieces of this new platform we're building is a reputation model, and that if a journalist is makes a statement that's subjected to a fact check by another journalist, that doesn't just have the impact of, you know, dinging the journalist who's alleged to be forwarding misinformation. It creates a relationship between two journalists, and as one journalist's reputation rises, if they have made a negative assessment of another journalist, that might have a bigger effect on the system than if that journalist's reputation falls. And so I think that we will need and will evolve tools that allow us to navigate these spaces that are going to be, it's not just journalists. Keep in mind that we have now two of our major platforms, at least, and rumor a third, are working on community notes. And that is to say, distributing the work of doing what, you know, fact checking for me falls under context work. Okay, so community notes, fact checking, verification, all of these things are about building context. And we're about to enter a Wild West where we've got users submitting context that's going to go around the internet and travel with things. And I think that it's probably inevitable that those community note systems will start sharing at least some data. And that's a really good thing. Like, just go off on a little tangent here. Like, our organization's totally impacted by this Zuckerberg decision. I think it's a terrible decision. Community notes, though, is not inherently a bad thing. Like, I think it's the case that we should have community contributions to context. We should have those happening alongside expert contributions, alongside formal, journalistic IFCN fact check contributions. And we should have systems that make sense of all of these and share data between every instance or every platform. So I kind of went off on a tangent there. I don't know if I answered the question or not, but
I may ask, since Beth Goldberg is here, if she wants to join the conversation for a second. We'll ping you back channel to make sure we're not catching you in the shower or elsewhere. But in the meantime, let me just ask you a related question. Since we've been talking a lot about the role of journalists and journalism, we have journalists here and journalism professors and students here. Do you want to see us do something different in terms of how we train the next generation of journalists? You talked about this not being their day job. Should it be what we're training people to do? Maybe it's not journalists, maybe it's something else. Are there other things? We're sitting in a university, we've got a lot of students here. Are there things we should be doing differently to help prepare to manage this new information landscape?
um, I think we need a big PR campaign to get um, young journalism students to not just think that they need to go into corporate communications, which is where it seems all the jobs are. I'm really, I mean, we have spent most of the 20 years of this org serving, our primary community has been journalism. And so, we have borne witness to the decay of the ecosystem. And I think that journalism is absolutely critically important. The skills that are going to be needed are increasingly technical, and uh, but I'm, and you will need to lean in to AI, and I think it's a totally false dichotomy to say that we've got, you know, the uh, that working with AI is somehow irreconcilable with the idea of doing journalism. I think everybody needs to lean into AI heavily, and journalists um, even more so. So I think that evolving research skill sets, um, being able to do data work is super critical for any modern journalist. And in terms of using tools like ours, uh, I really do think that it's more about like journalists as doing like data analytics work to understand where they should be attending their energy, and kind of having that as a baked in skill set, and that's maybe a little bit of a dig to the idea that the editor is going to set the priorities, and that might be a little bit of a squeezing the editor out of some of their power and their role. But I think that that ability for a journalist to look at data, look at an analytics dashboard and understand kind of what their audience needs will be an important part of the future of journalism.
I'm gonna deviate slightly because we have Beth here and she's willing to come off of to pipe it up here. So I'm going to take advantage of her being here and see, Beth, if you want to offer a question or a response or some reaction about how the tools you're working on interrelate.
Yeah, thanks so much, Beth. And Ed, thank you for all your comments. Big fan of your work.
Great.
I think I dropped in a comment in the chat that I'd love your thoughts on. And I'll give you a little bit of context about dual use for folks who aren't as familiar. But we just today released what we're thinking of as sort of the follow-up of Perspective API, which folks may be familiar with. It's a tool to detect toxicity. A lot of folks use it in content moderation, but we increasingly were hearing desire to be able to more customize that sort of identification of harmful speech. And so we launched a tool today that we're calling customizable attributes to be able to identify harmful parts of speech, or actually whatever you want. It could identify something that sounds like it's just off topic, and you want it removed from your particular subreddit or your Discord community or whatever. But what if that gets in the hands of a white supremacist subreddit? And so there's this dual use problem to having these really customizable LLM powered tools. How are you thinking about that? Have you seen that sort of access filtering done well by other products? How might you think about restricting access to these really powerful LLM filtering tools for bad
Yeah.
actors? Thanks.
Yeah. It's a really good question. It's a really hard question. I think that it is not something you need to worry about if you don't have scale. And for us, we are developing open source solutions. There's someone could clone the repo and use it to do terrible things. And the only answer I have to this, Beth, is just that we want to maintain the legal ability to gatekeep who uses our platform, and so we do not want organizations who are intent on um, uh, causing harm or denying rights, um, uh, to any community to be using our tools. And we don't have a scalable answer to this question, except to say that, this is our intention. We will reserve this legal right, and we will, swiftly take action if a white supremacist group started using our tools to better exchange knowledge that was, intended to harm
Yeah,
a population.
Let me ask you both.
that's
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Beth. Go ahead.
no, I was gonna say that sounds very reasonable and how radical to think that not everything has to scale.
Let me ask you both maybe to answer out loud and in the chat. Is it a losing battle to try to work on the harmful information problem as opposed to promoting the good information? John Priest, who self-identifies here as techno-flaneur, I like that handle, is essentially asking a question really about amplifying what we do want to hear as opposed to what we don't. And here, Beth, it's an open invitation to put some things in the chat about some of your recent work in this space. And I'm wondering, Ed, if that's also sort of a direction you're going in more, or whether we have to keep putting a finger in the dike.
Uh, yeah, we have been working on some gender disinformation efforts in South Asia, and that's involved collecting data sets, doing some of the work that Perspective does around finding those data sets and then assessing them. And in a really healthy world, those data sets are shared with content moderation teams and help make better online ecosystems. And right now, there's just it is not a good time to be working on these issues. And we're working on projects now that are concerned about the idea of using the term gendered disinformation or gendered harassment, because evidently that is controversial now, insanely. And so we've always seen this work, because we do call it context work. We've always seen that there's a complete grayscale between hate speech, violent content, disinformation, misinformation, uh, mid-information, what we call innocuous, unintended, and bad journalism. It's like there, and we encounter all of these, because our systems are, push from the user. We encounter all of these, and we need to protect journalists by building better filters for getting the stuff out of their inboxes. But it's like the internet is everything all at once. And if you're building a tool to do information work in the internet, you're going to encounter all these issues.
So Ed, we're at almost at the top of the hour. So what I want to do is give you a chance to sort of give a wrap-up answer, but then we will shift to virtual wine and cheese, where we'll give people a chance to ask some of their questions out loud and we have a lot of questions waiting, and I want to invite people to stick around. But let me ask you sort of a variation on a question a number of people have asked. Kaushik asks this sort of basically what's next for you, not in the immediate term, but in the long term. What's the big hope? There's another question in the chat about sort of the if you had the virtual magic wand question, if you could just do or see one thing. So this is your chance to kind of give some closing thoughts on looking ahead to the next decade. What do you see as being the big things you want to accomplish technically? And what are the big structural reforms that you want to see happen in the world to enable you to be more successful at your work?
No pressure. Yeah. So I I think that there's a through line that we've been witness to across all this work. And because we started working internationally, our first focus was in Egypt, and so we've seen these inequities play out. Technology based inequities around machine translation, around content moderation on social, around algorithms, algorithmic delivery of content, and every one of those inequities can be understood as being, fundamentally downstream of extractive data practices. And, you're getting the service in exchange for the data. Trust us, we'll make good use of the data. And that's never worked out well for journalism or for society, and I'd say for democracy as well. So my kind of vision for the future is we are on the brink. Well, we're into another platform revolution. Okay, so AI is I think rightly understood as a platform revolution, equal to social, equal to mobile, equal to the internet. And I want to model some non-extractive approaches to how we evolve AI. This does not mean that Meedan is going to compete with ChatGPT or Anthropic. What it does mean is that I see a future where we work on small language models, where we work on helping communities build, own, improve, and control the data that's used to power the chatbots that they use to meet their community information and knowledge needs. And I think that that's like retreating to the grassroots is the only way to kind of heal this system. I don't think it's going to heal from the top down. And I think it's so badly broken now, and that I think anything short of that, nothing is going to happen through the platforms. It's going to have to come from the grassroots up. And I think that model, plus a federated data sharing model that allows one community to share their data with another community that they might trust or share some commonality with, is a model where we start to get where we can imagine the internet being a really good, healthy place for democracy and collaboration and science and health and all of the things that we want it to be.
Ed, I want to thank you so, so much for spending some time with us today, for all the work that you and your team at Meedan do in fighting the good fight. We're going to put in the chat before we end the formal part of our program the wonderful talk you gave when accepting the Skoll Social Innovation of the Year Award this past year. Very, very well deserved, and will give people more of an insight into the history of the project, the origin of the name, and the Arabic meaning of it, and the work that you're doing, and some additional links. And now, as promised, we'll put a link in the chat to where to see news about upcoming talks in the series, the blog that we run that shares stories about AI and democracy, and we invite you to come and write for us as well and share the work you are doing in using AI to enhance and strengthen democracy and improve governance. We realize this is a marathon at this point and not a sprint. And through community and fellowship and conversations like these, we perhaps give each other a little more inspiration, or Ed at least gives us some inspiration to all keep doing the work that we're doing to strengthen our democracy in a time of siege. So with that said, as promised, with Ed's indulgence, we're going to end the live stream. Invite those who need to get going to other Zooms to do so. But invite those who are still here and want to still ask a question to do so. So we're going to call on you. I'm going to switch us, if we can switch back to gallery view for a moment so we can get a sense of who's here.